Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mind Clickers. I'm a sport and exercise scientist from Melbourne, Australia, with a passion for esports performance, coaching, and overall mental well-being. I've been in esports for quite my life, previously competing in COD 4 Pro Mod and coaching StarCraft 2, whilst avidly loving CSGO and all FPSs. I created Mind Clickers to provide an insight into the psychological and performance demands of elite-level gaming. This includes getting an insight from coaches, players, staff, org founders, and esports researchers about their respective domains. In the following episode, I chat with Robert Yip, who is the performance coach for the previous Misfits and Immortals and previous head coach for FlyQuest. Robert has worked 5 years, 2 in the LEC, 3 in the LCS, 3 splits as a head coach, and 7 as a performance coach, alongside having 8 years experience working in traditional sport. Robert shares some fantastic stories and experiences from his early days working with TLO as a performance coach, I'm jelly, and his transition to League of Legends. Robert has a very holistic and personalised approach to his coaching, where he always puts the player first to ensure their needs are met. Robert and I chat in depth about self-efficacy and the criticism sandwich for feedback and reflection, arousal and anxiety control, the importance of having a dynamic team culture that is flexible with varying leadership characteristics, and the role a coach plays in being a jack of all trades to physically, mentally, and emotionally prepare athletes for elite level competition. Finally, Robert has a really nice insight to finish it off that involves some key takeaways for some players, coaches, and staff who might be listening. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Mind Clickers Season 2, Episode 12, where, what time is it? It's time to click both heads in 2021. I'm joined here today by Robert Yip, previous performance coach for the previous Misfits and Immortals, and head coach for FlyQuest. Robert has worked 5 years, 2 in the LEC, 3 in the LCS, 3 splits as a head coach, and 7 as a performance coach, alongside having 8 years experience working in traditional sport. How are you going today, mate?
Not too bad. Very excited to be on your podcast today.
Yeah, fantastic, mate. Thank you for taking the time. Obviously, it's over there quite early in the morning, over there in Ireland, was it?
Yep, sunny Ireland.
Over there in sunny Ireland. Yeah, thanks for jumping on. Take some time, and I'm glad that we can dig in and have a really big episode, ripping and extrapolating tons of different topics. I'm sure it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, it's going to be a banger of an episode, I'm pretty sure.
Banger of an episode, that it is, my friend. I guess we'll do what we always do, is just start off with a bit of an introduction about yourself, some of your previous experience in traditional sports, and then that kind of shift into the esports scene.
Yeah, so I started off, let's say, wanting to go into college to be a teacher. That was like the very, very beginning. We're starting at the very start. And I did physical education for my undergrad, and there was a decent amount of psychology, sports science, sports coaching modules during that degree. So the more I started doing the practical work for teaching, I was like, this is fun. This is like, it's interesting. I obviously love working with kids. But when I started doing the sports coaching, the sports science module, I was like, I really like this. This is something that's really interesting for me. So I started kind of thinking maybe my future career doesn't have to necessarily go into teaching straight away. Possibly I'd be a better teacher with more life experience behind my back. That makes sense. I was trying to logic my way into changing career path. So yeah, once I finished my degree, I was like, okay, I like the whole physical side of things. I like the physical side of conditioning, etc. So I did personal training, sports massage, and then I was like, all right, this is fun. There's more to it. So I did a strength and conditioning certification. And I started coaching like teams that were locally around me, rugby teams, athletics, Gaelic games, etc. And after a few years of doing this, I was like, there's more to it than this. Players would come to you kind of like an agony aunt, and they would tell you their problems from home, from the team, from the coach. And they found it a very comfortable medium to come to the strength and conditioning coach and talk about this. I'm just there trying to get them to run around and like sweat it off, but they're telling you these things. I'm like, all right, this is interesting. I'm not sure why they're very open to me about this, but it's interesting. And like I said, there's more. I wanted to have more feathers in my cap. I wanted to look at kind of everything to do with developing players. So I did a master's in sport and exercise psychology in Ireland, and that was like the holy grail. Like it kind of opened up my third eye towards like what is actually possible. So I'm blending like physical conditioning and mental conditioning,
Mm-hmm.
and I've been doing this for a few years. And once I kind of graduated, I kind of reached out to esports teams. I'd been following it for a while. The real kicker is a friend of mine, big into gaming, was like, "Listen, esports is big. It's really interesting. It might be aligned with your degree." And I was like, "Yeah, yeah, sounds cool."
Yeah.
And I was a decent gamer at the time, but I didn't really think about competitive gaming. And then after about a year, he's like, "Listen, you got to watch this. This is like MLG Anaheim. This is StarCraft. This is big." And I watched and I was blown away. I'm watching like Huck, I'm watching Idra, I'm watching these players, and I'm like, God damn, like the stuff that they're going through on stage, it's really
Mm-hmm.
similar to a lot of traditional sports athletes go through all the time as well. So I reached out to a few teams, and it was Team Liquid that got back to me. Victor Goosens, who's like the founder of Team Liquid, and he's like, "Listen, we might have a player who's interested. If you want to email to him." So I emailed. His name was TLO, the little one, or Dario Wunschk,
Oh,
and
hey. Yep.
yeah, and he was like, "Yeah, I'm going to Korea, but like let's keep in contact. Let's talk and see where it goes." And I'd just been like, I guess like working with him for a few years, but it's very very like informal. But we spent a decent time together. I went to Home Story Cup. I went to DreamHack Valencia with him, etc. And it was really nice because he's the sort of guy that's completely open to anything, right? He's willing to try whatever it takes. And it was a great kind of like learning curve for me to learn about esports through him because he was so open. And yeah, that brought me into League of Legends, working with Origin in Summer Split 2015 before moving to Immortals in LA, where I started kind of my full-time in-house career as a performance coach. Uh, I had done this is a long origin story, but I had done a um, kind of a presentation about periodization in esports, and I think Dylan or Noah had maybe seen it, and then they contacted me, and I had an interview, and then afterwards they're like, "Listen, do you want to move to LA to work?" And I'm in Ireland. I'm looking out my window. It's pouring rain. I'm like peering out from the curtain on my phone, and I'm like, "Yeah, I'd love to move to LA to work over there." So that's basically how I got started off in, I guess, like my career path and in esports as well.
Yeah, interesting. That's such. There's so many things that we can extrapolate from that. I love that kind of early entry, traditional sports mindset. The teaching, so obviously that kind of correlates later on when you went down that coaching route as well. Some of those teaching characteristics would have been drawn out. So that's really interesting to look at as well. Alongside that experience, alongside TLO, big jealousy there from myself. Um, but yeah, also love the StarCraft scene just because how cognitively demanding the game is. I think it's been referred to as one of the most mentally tough games in the world, just because of that kind of one man army pressure. You know, it's yourself versus them. You don't have anyone other teammates to rely upon. So there's some really interesting studies done with StarCraft, but absolute brilliant of a game.
Yeah,
But really, oh,
I was going to say it's my first love kind of a game in esports, and if I could choose one game, if I'm stuck on a desert island alone and I can only have one game to play, it would probably be StarCraft because you're only limited by like what your fingers and your brain can do. If
exactly.
you play really really well, like your macro is good, your micro is on point, but you can almost never come out of a game thinking, "Oh, I was really unlucky there." It's like, nah, you could have definitely played better because the ceiling is so high in StarCraft, and even more so in Brood War.
Yeah, exactly. So working alongside TLO, what were the sort of things you went through? And was it more so ticking those external performance boxes, hydration, nutrition, sleep? Was it more so looking at that in-game mentality? What were the sort of things you worked with him alongside?
It was kind of all of the above. So
Right.
it was my first entry into esports. So thankfully, I wasn't, let's say, thrust into a situation where I was working with a team and it's my first time and I have to learn about esports and do my job and make
Mm,
mistakes. So I kind of learned with Dario as well. So this was
mhm.
2011, 12. This is a long time ago. So esports, there would have been a lot of permeating ideas that were some right, some definitely wrong, and we had to figure out what actually worked for us. So when we're starting with it, it was on the premise of sports psychology. But when we got into it, it was about building diaries, building habits, optimizing training, things like this. And it just became a lot more applied, a lot more kind of like, hey, let's just try this out. Let's see if this works or not and see how it feels. And we had a lot of good feedback loops with each other because, he would be very, very, very good at communication and talking about things and very detail orientated. He's very German. And it was very nice to kind of like make my mistakes with him, because then when I moved on to focusing really on League of Legends, I'd already made a lot of mistakes. And that's one of the big things that my lecturer said to us before we left. He's like, listen, you're going to make a ton of mistakes. You're going to make a lot of mistakes in your first job, second job, third job, but it's okay because you have to. And then by the time you get to your fourth, fifth, and sixth job, you're going to be a lot more refined. You're going to have learned a lot of things from before. And I guess it's like a misnomer. People think that, okay, you have your college degree, you're going to be fine. But you've got like hundreds of people that are graduating with similar degrees. What really sets you apart is like the experience that you have, and it's like the mistakes that you make, the mistakes that you're willing to make going forward. And I kind of had that mindset for me where it's like, I don't know where this is going because no one else had done it before. So I'm going to make these mistakes myself. I'm going to own them. And then I guess like try to learn from them so that I don't make them in the future. And that's kind of like what the formative years were for me. The first, I would say 4 to 5 years. And honestly, like when people are coming into esports, and I see this a lot, they want to get involved in esports. They don't really care where they get involved, like, tier 1, 2, 3. But I always tell them, like, you can work in traditional sports. You can not put all your eggs in one basket. You can learn your trade before you hit esports. And that's kind of what I did. I paid my dues. I feel like I did my 4 to 5 years of preparing myself before I got my first full-time job in esports. And I think that was like the making of me.
Yeah, I love that kind of backstory, that arc. It's almost like an anime. I love the fact that you got engaged within the scene early on. So you almost have, pretty much basically a veteran to the scene. And going through those kind of different experiments, is this going to work? Is that not going to work? It's almost like a blacksmith, right? A blacksmith first, when he makes a sword, he's going to make a few mistakes. He's going to have a few dints. He might break the sword. He might do something that's not really right. But over time, he's going to become better and better and better, and he's going to be able to do it in one shot. And it's kind of chipping away those different angles, looking at everything from a different perspective until you can really kind of hammer it on the head. So I really love that kind of mindset that you had. And then, leading from that, back arc of StarCraft experience working alongside TLO and then getting engaged in the League of Legends scene. Was getting into the League scene something you envisioned? Did you envision staying in StarCraft forever, sticking to another RTS, moving to something like CSGO, for example?
That's a good question. So I think I hadn't really formulated a roadmap as to like where I wanted to go, or what it would look like. It was just a case of I could see the parallels between esports and traditional sports, and I could see that maybe further down the line there might be an opportunity for sports psychs or performance coaches to move into the scene. But it would require teams to have the available like inclination to pick up someone, so foresight, and also like the financial capacity as well. And I think it was until around 2015 in LCS where coaches were mandated. So I had to wait basically until that was a possibility. And
yeah, right.
Yeah, I think it was just a case of waiting for the scene to mature to a point where you could make a full-time living out of it and make a full-time job out of it. And I think right now you can see a lot more teams that are actually taking the holistic performance side and player development side a lot more seriously, like in LCS and in LEC as well. And it's very like optimistic. It's very heartening to see that, because there was a point at which only a handful of teams would actually invest in this, and I think it was just down to a lack of like prioritization in player development.
Right.
And I think EU has overtaken NA kind of in the player development side of things. Like the way they go about things is a lot more different. But I think that's I just really enjoy, and I'm talking to a lot more people that are trying to get in the scene, people that are in the scene now. It makes it a lot easier. Like just go on that Discord call with a group of performance coaches from different countries, and it's really nice. Like it used to be a very solo adventure, and now it's a multiplayer adventure, and it's much more enjoyable experience.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So back then, when you were, I guess, entering into the first LCS, what was the mindset in regards to other organizations? So obviously, in that early stage, as you said, player development, external player quality of life maybe wasn't a focus, especially from that performance perspective. So was it, from that, having this background, having this experience working alongside previously in StarCraft, previously in traditional sports, was it disheartening to see that there wasn't enough emphasis for player mentality?
I wouldn't say disheartening. I think it was. It felt good to be a front runner. So when I was on
Right.
Immortals, there wasn't a lot of player development coaches or performance coaches in the scene. So yeah,
You had the advantage.
I was honestly too happy to be involved and like too excited to get started to worry about the overall state of the ecosystem on a
Uh,
whole. Um, I think it's a lot easier now after working for a few years to look back and think, okay, I could see where people or teams were trying to incorporate that into what they were doing. But for the most part, I think the same failure applies. It's where they bring someone on, like a performance coach, not quite sure what they're supposed to do. And in the end, they're like, okay, well, we assumed you would do this. But what they're looking for is, I guess, immediate results. They're looking for something to move the needle. But it's difficult because your success as a performance coach is kind of tied to the success of the team. So sometimes you can have a performance coach that looks very, very good because the team's doing well. And then that same performance coach can look worse by comparison when the team isn't doing fantastically well. And I think that's a bit of a misconception because
mhm.
our work will improve the performance of the team, but sometimes there are larger or greater issues that make it so that the team is losing, even though the performance or player development department is doing a good job. I think there's a lot of good examples of good performance coaches that do excellent jobs, and the teams
Mhm.
are not setting the world on fire. But I think the more you incorporate said performance coaches into like other areas of the team, and it doesn't have to be in a we need to give this person full autonomy over a player recruitment and this and that. It's just more of a case of like an opinion is important and an opinion is powerful, and the more that you can crowdsource your decision making towards all members of your team, the more they're going to feel part of what you're actually doing. It could be a performance coach, it could be a manager, it could be a social media guy, like whatever it might be. Like people feel like that they're all pulling in the same direction when they're asked for their opinion. And I think the best decisions are almost always made when you get multiple differing opinions and not just having one person in charge of the sole direction of the team. And I think that's something where I've seen a lot more where I'm hearing from performance coaches like, yeah, I'm actually involved in this, or I help with player recruitment, I do player profiles, etc. And I think that's great because it means that when that player comes in, everybody is unilaterally kind of aligned and on the same page that this is the person that we wanted because they were given their input. And that's better than kind of like inheriting players or ergo inheriting problems along the line. So
Mhm.
I think that's going to be the future of esports, where it's not just going to be, because before when I came in, it was kind of like the head coach kind of made the decisions. It's like, okay, you know the most about the game. You tell me who we should bring in, and then it kind of became we have GMs now who are making decisions, and I can't speak from like my own experience, but I think that GMs would have been like, okay, the buck stops with me. Very sports related, very important as well. But I think better GMs will probably open up the forum towards people and be like, okay, we're gonna work out who we think we need. I'm gonna have the last say, but I want to hear your opinions as well.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, you see it in traditional sport as well, right? Working within a multidisciplinary team, you have
Mm.
individuals designated to a particular aspect for player performance. We have nutritionalists that help with diet. We have physiotherapists that help with injury rehab and sustainability for players. We have strength and conditioning coaches who can help with ongoing and current performance. And why can't we have that in esports? Why can't we have different people helping to work together, to collaborate together to ensure that player performance is at its best? And I think it's crucial, it's inevitable, and it's one of those things that's going to happen. And it's honestly fantastic because I think that being such a mentally and cognitively draining a sport, some of these players do need support, and whether that be some players don't want the support. I think what's important is that the support is available. When you have the availability, whether or not players use it, it's obviously down to themselves. But being able to provide that support and have accessibility to the support is crucial. Now, I've chatted with a couple of performance coaches on Mind Clickers, and I've heard kind of different, all very similar, but sometimes a little bit here and there different kind of mindset and opinions of what a performance coach does. So I would love to hear your kind of mindset towards a performance coach and what their role should be within a team.
So yeah, I think I would always give the PR answer of the physical, emotional, and psychological well-being of players, and that kind of encompasses a lot. There's two schools of thought right now with regard to specificity, in that maybe the role of the performance coach is too broad. It covers too much. If you look at job descriptions for teams looking for a performance coach, you need to have your undergrad in some sports related field. You need your postgrad in some sports related field. You need a strength and conditioning qualification. You need nutritional
Understanding,
qualification again. Yeah. And it covers a lot. A good example I will give is at Mad Lions, for example. I'm very jealous of the structure they have there. So they have a sole sports psychologist. They also have a personal trainer, and they also have a osteopath with information in nutrition. So we're talking multidisciplinary, like you did before. And I think this is the holy grail of this. This is like you get to go to work and work with people in the field that have enough lateral information about your job that they can contribute and help you, and you can talk to them about like issues that you have as a practitioner, and you're working as a team. And I think that's like super fantastic. And then on the other hand, you have performance coaches that are kind of told, okay, you have to do all of the above. You have to do everything at the same time. And I'm kind of betwixt and between regarding like this, because specificity means that, okay, you could kind of choose just sports psychology or just one aspect versus doing everything by yourself. And I guess the term performance coach, even its label, even its name, it kind of brings up images of you're going to deal with all forms of performance, whatever that might be. And it makes it difficult because you're kind of spread like a little bit thin. I think that teams kind of want you to fix everything at once, instead of a performance coach coming in and you saying, okay, I'm going to fix the sleep and eating and the schedule, like waking and going to sleep. I'm going to fix these first because these are the most important, instead of like trying to fix everything at once, which is hard, even for the players and the coaching staff, to deal with that much change in all aspects of the day and training. It's difficult. So I would say that it's a little bit of everything. And I think most performance coaches that are kind of like under that moniker should have information or knowledge about all of the above. But it's not necessarily like a big thing. I think a lot of the performance coaches are set in the background of psychology, first and foremost, I would say. But yeah, I think it's mostly this. But I think we probably need a bit more specificity in terms of like what we call, or like what our speciality is in.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely agree. It's definitely a super interesting thing to look at, because you draw those kind of comparisons to traditional sport, and then you draw the comparisons to esports, and a lot kind of links over, but then a lot is kind of not. So I definitely agree what you said earlier in regards to specificity. Are we looking too broad? Are we trying to tick too many boxes, but running out of penning? How are we trying to
Hmm.
address this? And it's a very interesting scene to try and understand. Myself personally, so currently doing a postgrad in rehabilitation counseling. So my ultimate goal is to get into the esports scene with that, undergrad in exercise science and that kind of external performance understanding, but then also using more of a counseling approach to indirectly promote change for players, to help with promoting change, whether it be to help them with their performance externally, or whether it be directly helping to promote change on a day to day quality of life kind of understanding. I definitely think that, as you said just earlier, with different multidisciplinary teams, it's crucial, and I can only imagine having that holy grail.
I think just to latch on to what you mentioned about like the your postgrad, I think a lot of people, especially in the early days, like 15, 16, 17, they were looking for a sports psychology degree. And
Mm.
it was very in vogue at the time. It was the fashionable thing to have. But I do believe, and I guess this opens up Pandora's box regarding barrier of entry. But I think that it's less about the degree you have, and more about how you apply, I guess, your knowledge and your relationship building skill set. So
Hmm.
it might be difficult for someone to have gotten into esports before, let's say, with a counseling degree, postgrad or not. But I actually feel like that shouldn't be the that shouldn't be the case. I guess
Right.
it's hard because like you want to get in for the interview, you want to get in to show what you can do, but teams shouldn't be turning away people based off of the fact that the degree isn't, let's say, a sports psychology degree, or it's not exactly what they're looking for, word for word. So I do feel like teams should definitely open up the door towards people that have, I guess, like a certain demeanor, experience, that have a methodology behind them that they're following. So if I was hiring for a performance coach position or for a psychology position, it doesn't necessarily have to be sports psychology, um, as long as that's what you're looking for. If a team is looking and they need a sports psychologist and they have sports psychology problems, then a sports psychologist is probably best. But I think that there's a lot of benefit to be had from bigger organizations. Let's say hiring a athletic counselor to work with three of their teams. So if they have a Fortnite team, a League team, and an Overwatch team, it's like, we have an athletic counselor. This person is going to help with, I guess, like non-sports psychology problems, because especially during COVID times as well, there's a lot of work to be done with teams who struggle with living with COVID in COVID times.
Yeah.
And I feel like it's like an entryway into working like with competitive teams. So I feel like it's a really good pathway for people to get involved in esports, is to reach out and be like, okay, I can do this, this, and this, and that would be something that teams might not have thought that they were looking for, like quality of life increases just by hiring
Hmm.
someone like that. And it's not always like the competitive aspect that has to change and increase. It's like, okay, we have people who can help, with family problems, with study problems, with just
Yeah.
generally like, how do I get along with this guy in my team that, you know, really gets on my nerves
Yeah.
or grinds my gears. And yeah, I think that like teams should like definitely open up a little bit more and kind of widen the I guess like type of degrees that could possibly be used in esports, as long as you understand like what they do, because different psychology degrees obviously mean different things.
Things. Yeah. And what do you think is required to make that step, that transition? Is it some team to start employing, whether it be a counselor or a specific sports psychologist, and to see those results after a season or after a split, for example? What's going to be the stepping stone that makes that transition where these people are going to be the norm?
That's a good question. uh, I'm gonna throw it back at your face. What
Yeah.
would you say if I'm hiring you and I say, okay, what will I see or what will I hear that would show me that you're doing a good job or that your job is valuable and effective?
That's a good question. I would think that obviously working in such a player centralized area, I think the players obviously have to be the first priority, right? We have to look at the players, we have to look at what they're doing and what they're understanding. What's their mindset towards change, for example? What's their mindset towards the game? Obviously, playing at the elite level, they're going to be ultra competitive with that mindset naturally. They're going to have that ability to excel and to exceed what they set out to do. And then we have to also look at that from a different perspective. What happens if they have that ability to do so, but then don't go ahead and do so? What happens if they take an L that could have been a W? What kind of drastic effects is that going to have on some of these players? And that's where we can look to, I guess, the role of a counselor, the role of a sports psychologist to help some of these players deal with that, to help some of these players walk away understanding that sometimes a loss is even a win. Taking away, extrapolating some of the key things from a loss can actually turn into having more future positive experiences. And I guess that can be looked at from an analytical perspective, looking at VOD reviews, working with players one-on-one in regards to visualization, helping players in that kind of approach. And I guess there's, a whole different kind of avenue of things that we can look at. But I think the key thing is to help players start to understand change and the importance of it and why change is crucial. Sometimes change isn't crucial in the present, but sometimes change is crucial and inevitable in the future.
Mm-hmm. I think that basic premise is something that probably a lot of people would spout, whether or not you have a counseling background, clinical psychology background, or sports psychology background. And I think that's the main takeaway point, is that no matter your background, a lot of the roots of application and how we're going to approach problems and change in general, behavioral issues and habits, is basically similar. That's why I think like teams really need to have an understanding of what issues that they're looking for the practitioner to solve. So if you have a player who's got body dysmorphic problems or depression, right? You're probably not going to want to hire anyone other than a clinical psychologist. I think you're going to want to put someone in who's got a clinical background in that. In the same way, if you've got a person who's got problems regarding performance issues, you're probably not going to put in a clinical psychologist in a sports competitive setting. You could probably use a sports psychologist, a counselor, et cetera, depending on experience. But it's like a needs requirements. You want to figure out like why you're bringing in the person, and then you're going to tell that person, okay, this is the thing we need to be changed. This is our biggest problem, blah blah blah. Or even exploratory, you bring in someone you're not quite sure about what the issues are. That person comes in to spend some time, observation, write a report, and they're like, okay, these are your biggest problems. This is what you're probably going to need. This is a list of people that fulfill this need. Like, where do you want to start? And I think that's like a really interesting thing that we don't really see in esports, because a lot of the issues are diagnosed by people that are already kind of like endemic in the scene, or kind of looking at it. They're kind of like, okay, I think this is their problem, and I think this is how we fix it, and I think this is the right person for the job. That's a lot of question marks.
It is a lot of question marks, and it's one of those things that I guess we're going to learn with time, right? Traditional sport has taken quite a long time to adopt and to kind of nail down these key principles. Whereas esports, we've had such an exponential growth in the last 5 years. What's going to be like in the next 3 years, where performance coaches, player wellbeing coaches, clinical psychologists, sports psychologists could be at the ready hand for every team within the top 1, 2, 3 tiers. It's going to be really interesting to look at. And I'm honestly looking forward to it, because I think that's what it needs. It needs the adoption, the widespread adoption of external people. And I definitely agree with what we've just chatted about. The kind of title shouldn't dictate, what that person's capable of, their previous experiences. I think what we need to look at is specifically the key set of skills that each person's capable of doing. And I think that is where we're going to see the differences.
Yeah. I'm going to hold up my hand and I guess like take the blame for the label performance coach. When I joined Immortals for my contract, And Noah was okay. What are we going to put down? Let's just put down life coach for your contract. And I was like, hell no, you're not putting down life coach. As I'm not going to be known as a life coach like for my entire time in esports. So he says, what do you want it to be then? I mulled it over for a little bit. I was like, I don't know, performance coach. And I felt like that was kind of a generalization, but we put
Mm.
that down, and then obviously more and more people came into the scene using the term performance coach and whatnot. But maybe I should have started off by being more specific regarding like what I do, and it might have made a difference. But what we have now is just a performance coach, and maybe we'll move away from that, maybe not. But yeah, that's my bad, guys.
Mate, that's all right. I salute you. I do not want to be called a life coach. That's all right. I don't
Yeah.
want to take that. Um, so let's kind of dig in a little bit deeper now. Let's take the shovel out and let's toss some mud out and let's go a little bit deeper, hey? Working directly with the Immortals and the Misfits and FlyQuest as well. What was that experience like? Obviously, maybe it was different from team to team. What was that experience like working as a performance coach, and how did that differ to being a head coach, for example?
That's a good question. So performance coach was, especially on Immortals on my first team, was pretty all encompassing. Anything outside of the game, I had like a purview over. So I worked with Dylan in my first year, and that was great
Mm-hmm.
because Dylan really understood the benefit of like a performance coach and what was important.
Yep.
He had a good eye for things outside of the game, like sleep is the most important predictor of performance. So he knew that sleep was important, and the stories that from that first year that me and Dylan and Dodo like did regarding like to try increase performance is actually insane. One example. So we knew that sleep is important, right? So like we have the ambient temperature down for the rooms. Like it's at the correct cold temperature, and light's the most important thing. So the players had this giant semicircle window really, really high up, like 16 feet up. You can't get to it. So all the light was coming in through there. So that was interrupting their sleep. So we're like, okay, we need to fix that. We have to go rent a really big ass ladder. And then we construct this semicircle like a sunblocker from the Simpsons episode out of cardboard and duct tape, and we go up there and we just basically stick it onto the semicircle to block all the light off, and it worked for a time, but eventually like it fell apart, much like Icarus flying close to the sun. But for a time it was like perfect. It was like complete darkness. It was great. They weren't waking up when the sun was coming up, and like we went to like great lengths, not just this but other things as well, to make sure that everything was perfect for the players.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I really liked about that first year that I had, was that there was really no distinction between what responsibilities we had regarding our role. It kind of felt like a team startup. So there wasn't a, oh, you're the manager, this is your job. Oh, you're, performance coach, this is your job. We would all help each other with our jobs. We'd all help each other with the different things we had to do in the day. And there was no backstabbery or anything, or like I'm higher up in the hierarchy than you are. And it felt very much like that on a daily basis, which I really, really liked. And after that, like the difference between head coaching and performance coaching is honestly kind of night and day. I think I did a certain amount of like performance coach roles as head coach, and then it was hard because there was a certain expectation when you're a head coach to do certain things, but it's difficult because at the time you don't have as much game knowledge, you don't have as much experience, and it's difficult to kind of insert yourself into certain conversations. And I think that's something that I learned kind of earlier on, is like it's a little bit more difficult to get involved in things that you want to and should be able to. I think a good example of someone who does it really well, let's say for Peter Dunn, he's going to be working with multiple coaches and staff and teams, and he's the head coach, but he's like the smartest guy in league. He knows so much about like major minor regions, like every single player.
Right.
He's like so like involved in everything, that obviously he makes that job like he's the perfect representation of that job. But I think for my position, I probably could have done a better job for sure, regarding implementing or creating buy-in for what I was doing initially, because I was kind of
Right.
trying to do it from a head coach point of view rather than a this is important because X and Y. It's more of a you guys should do this because you should do this rather than trying to convince them of something. And it was definitely a little bit more difficult. I feel like more comfortable for sure in a performance coach role. But I think a lot of it comes down to your staff as well. I think that in terms of like how you're able to create your structure, I think it's almost like when you're creating a team with players, you want to bring on people that kind of have similar play styles or have played together or have experience together. And even if I have staff that I've never worked with before, something I've kind of realized recently is that you kind of all meet for a boot camp situation for the first time. Players meet players, players meet coaches, coaches meet coaches. And I kind of wish that you actually had the coaching staff. You go to Cancun, you go to Korea, you go to wherever, and you spend 2 weeks there, and you bond, you talk about things, you kind of break the ice, you learn where people's limits are, their boundaries are, like what they value, what the priorities are, and you do it for 2 weeks, and then you go boot camp and you meet the players for the first time. But at this point, the staff are already they already had that synergy, and we never talk about
Right.
staff synergy. We always talk about player synergy, and I think staff going away, like go to the mountains, like no phone signal, nothing, and then by the time you come back, you've got 2-week-old beards. You're all like a little bit older, a little bit wiser. You're a lot closer together. You've all run from the mountain bears. Like that kind of a bonding experience, I think, is invaluable as you go forward, because you don't want to be solving problems and coming across these like kind of like impasses as staff in front of players. You want to solve all of these things behind closed doors. And I think whenever I'm working on a staff again that maybe are kind of new and we don't know each other, we should definitely go away for a while and kind of get to know each other.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what that ultimately comes down to at the baseline is that kind of team culture, right? Kind of jumping into a new team fresh as a performance coach straight away. Maybe you don't have that understanding of that kind of team culture aspect, how well, the staff communicate with each other, that kind of staff to player to coach relationship, that kind of Bermuda Triangle of understanding. And I think team culture is one of those things that kind of really signifies the mindset of a team. So when you jumped in with these teams, was it something that you had to adopt quickly? Was it something that you kind of just clicked straight away? Was it something that took a little while to kind of understand and try and to embody?
I think you have to be kind of like a chameleon. You got to be a bit flexible, because
Mm,
no matter how knowledgeable you or I are, we're not going to be able to change the strong opinions of 5 different people, 3 different coaching staff
yep.
if we're brought in. We kind of have to spend a little bit of time observing. And I've been asked this before when I've started with a team, like, well, when are you going to start doing stuff? I'm like, there's a certain bedding in period where you're observing how people are, like how they react to other people, because you're in the honeymoon period, or the players are. So they're putting on their best face. They're trying to give a good first impression. But
Yeah.
coming in and trying to make changes straight away isn't really the best thing to do, because you want to see how the cards lie.
Yeah.
And it's important that kind of people recognize that you can't always be trying to like change. Sometimes you have to see if the change sticks, and if it does, then that's great, because then the player didn't need any reinforcement. But if you're constantly giving feedback and reinforcement and you're not quite sure if it's going to stick, then come the end of the season when it's crunch time and it falls apart, you're like, oh, actually, I wish I had known that this wasn't actually habitualized yet. I wish I had known that this is something that he was still struggling with. So there's definitely a
Mm,
certain period of like, okay, I'm going to see if you can fly solo. And when I go into a team, it's mostly trying to like figure out like where the strong voices are, what their priorities are, what their values are, and then try to work around that. Because if you come in really hot in the beginning, like, all right, guys, we're going to do morning yoga at 8 a.m. We're going to go to the
yeah.
gym. We're going to go for a run
This,
in the morning.
this.
It can be really bad, because then you're like, oh, I didn't realize that this player doesn't like to do running because he's maybe overweight and he's self-conscious, and he's going to be lagging behind the rest of the players, and that immediately makes him feel really bad. So you want to figure out like, what's the lowest hanging fruit? What can you do? And I think like that's super important to any behavioral change you're putting in any new habit or structure. Is like you got to make sure that it's going to stick, and if the player has a bad first experience of something, it's a lot less likely that they're going to go, yeah, I want to do this again. So you got to make sure that everyone has a good time. You're like that person who's like the tour guide who wants to make sure that everyone on the tour is having a good time, and then it's a lot more likely they're going to come back.
Yeah, for sure. I love that kind of mindset, the tour guide. I think you definitely see it. I've had a previous couple of chats with multiple. So I've had a couple of chats with a sports psychologist, performance coach. And, the generalized mindset is quite often that of a tour guide. So, that initial understanding, we always say the first impression is, almost always the best one. And you don't want to come in all guns blazing, let's go, let's go, let's go. You want to have come in with that kind of almost kick back understanding and approach where, okay, I'm going to absorb, I'm going to be the sponge. I'm going to absorb everyone's kind of comms. I'm going to start to understand the communication style between the players, how coaches, how staff members talk with each other. And that allows you to, as you said, be a chameleon and be flexible. And I think that's crucial. I think it's pivotal. And I think is essential to have that mindset, especially when jumping on with a new team.
Yeah, I'm nodding along with you. I completely agree. When you're on a new team, you're like, I think a big thing is that you want to make everyone feel like that they're like there is structure, but you want to make them feel like that they're kind of like in control of what's going on. It's like a choose your own adventure. You don't want to make people feel like, oh, I'm on a new team and we're on this ride and we can't get off, and we're not meant to say anything, because like in the beginning you're not meant to complain or rock the boat. You're just meant to kind of smile and nod. So if you're looking for big behavioral changes, players will probably go along with it, but they might not like it. So you're not going to know as well, because you're not going to be open and honest enough with you, because you haven't built up that trust in that relationship yet. So that's the most important thing, is you build up that trust, you'll build up the relationship. You make sure that when you need to be honest and have high levels of transparency and directness, that you can, because they respect you and they trust you. And that takes time. You can't force that. There's no way of shortcutting that.
So when you were working with a team, the Immortals or the Misfits or with FlyQuest, was there ever a situation where one of the players didn't want, that external help? They didn't want that support. They weren't really open. They maybe previously hadn't had a chat with a sports psychologist or, a performance coach before, and they hadn't had that before. And if so, how do we try and, kind of engage with them and kind of loop them in?
Old Rob and new Rob would deal with it differently. Old Rob came across this situation and he couldn't understand why the team would just be okay with the player kind of saying, I'm not doing this. It affects me negatively when I do this. It's not really my forte. And I think at the time, because I was fairly new and I had just come off a year of players, or a team of players that were willing to do whatever and whatever I said, which was, I guess, like it conditioned me to think that this was the norm. But I remember Dylan telling me this isn't normal. Like the team that we have now is not the norm. It's not always going to be this easy. And he was correct. And I think in that situation, old Rob struggled a little bit to deal with that, and that's more of a reflection on my growth as a coach, or lack of growth in that situation. That's something I've rectified since. So at the time, the player wasn't interested in doing X or Y. And the interesting thing is, years later, he would message me and he would say, like, I'm really sorry. I actually understand what you're trying to do. Those things that you're trying to make me do are actually really important. I feel much better when I do them. My bad, basically. Like, I actually understand now. And that made me feel good, because I kind of felt like if he gave it a chance, that he would actually realize the same things then that he realizes now. But now my approach is different. If a player is like really against something, it's less about how can I convince him to do it, and more about, can we find a middle ground? Can we find an alternative that he would be happy with? Because not everyone wants to do the same thing in the same way, but they all want to contribute and feel like that they're doing something beneficial for the team. So kind of like a more developed coaching mindset is that they don't have to do what you say, but a win is a win if you can get them to agree to do something else, because the idea is possibly very, very sound, but they just kind of disagree in terms of application. And that's fine, because you're never going to get everyone to agree with exactly how to do something, even though they all agree with the idea.
Yeah, gotcha. It's really interesting looking at that from that understanding. I definitely agree from those kind of both perspectives and the way you dealt with it. And it's definitely one of those things, I guess, almost like dealing with ambivalence, for example.
Mm-hmm.
People who see both reasons to change and reasons to not to. Inside they have that inner court case where we have one jury or lawyer that's arguing for one case and another that's arguing for one. And I guess that, the key crucial thing is, though, that they have that change mindset. Change is there, that jury is there. And I think that's a crucial stepping stone, having that, I guess, implanted seed, having that implanted change possibility. If you're ambivalent, you're one step closer to changing. And I think it's, from my experience, I dealt with previously, so back in StarCraft with a Japanese player, and he was kind of a little bit ambivalent in regards to sleep. So he knew that sleeping was crucial for performance. He knew that
Mm-hmm.
if you had a big game day in the morning, maybe you should sleep a little bit early, just so that he's feeling a bit more fresh in the morning. And he agreed, and he had that understanding, and he knew the key benefits, but then didn't go ahead and do it. He felt like I better stay up grinding a little bit more. I better start, grinding a little bit more. Then only ended up getting, a couple of hours of sleep. So he was ambivalent in regards to change, because on one sort of the spectrum, on one end of the spectrum, he understood change, but then on the other one, he didn't. So I think it's one of those ones where it's kind of tricky to deal with, but once we can put that lock in the door and unlock it, it really comes through.
Yeah, it's obviously the cycle of change. If you're not in a position where you're willing to change, then it's kind of like wasted energy for both
Yeah.
parties. And I think that often, which is kind of like counterintuitive, you need the player to fail or to experience failure so that they can internalize that negative experience, and
Hmm.
that forces them, or that's the catalyst for them to change later on. So sometimes you know that a player is going to suffer from something, but if you force them to change, it's not really of their own volition. It's not really internalized. So even if they fail, they're going to blame something external, because they're not going to blame themselves because they were coerced into doing something they didn't want to do. So sometimes seeing a player make the wrong decision, have a negative outcome, is what you need in order for them to, in the future, choose the correct path.
Yeah. And I guess that kind of leads into, when you were in working with one of those teams, or, when it was a massive decider game, for example, and then the team actually lost. How was that? What was that kind of feeling with the players afterwards? Was that tension there? Was that, mindset? I have to be careful when I'm talking to some of these players, because obviously they're going to be upset, but obviously you want to support them. So, where do you find that even footing ground in providing support to players after a big loss, because you know it's going to be so impactful for them?
It's a good question. The emotional cost after, I guess, like even any exertion, you kind of see it in combat sports as well, like after boxing or MMA, where
Right.
there's there's a physical cost for sure, the battering you just
Mm-hmm.
took, but there's also the emotional cost. And you might just see that fighters are just like emotionally spent. Maybe they break down, maybe they cry, maybe something like this, because you're holding in, you're kind of like repressing all of these like emotions that you have. It's fight or flight, but you only have one response, which is fight. And in esports or in competition, it's similar. You're kind of giving it your all. You're trying to push all the negative thoughts away. You're trying to make sure that you're only thinking about winning. There's only a positive outcome. And then at the end, when it's over, like, where do you go from that point? You're kind of hitting a wall. You're going from practicing every day, every night, like no days off, and you have this really strict schedule, and then suddenly, boom, you're done. And then you're being told, what are you going to do? What do you have available to you right now? Your entire structure is kind of just completely halted. So you've kind of hit the barrier going at 100 miles an hour. And sometimes you're going to want to say a few words. I don't know if the words matter so much as the fact that the players feel like that there is some sort of closure or finality, or that the person that's speaking actually understands how they're feeling.
Yeah.
So is the coach doing it for himself, or is the coach doing it for the players? And I've seen coaches pull out a speech where it's like, okay, yeah, this actually hits home. This resonates really, really well. And he's done a fantastic job. And I've seen coaches do it where they're saying something because they feel like they have to say something. But generally speaking, the players feel pretty bad immediately after a game. They're distraught for the most part. They're forlorn. They're quite upset, and you have to let them sit with their feelings for a while and figure out like which players need that kind of like direct support, which players are going to like have some positive reaction to the game, whatever that might be, and then players who maybe disappear a little bit, who kind of go inside themselves, and maybe they're the players you have to talk with. But at the end of the day, every player can benefit from like support at the end of a big loss, but it just depends on if you really understand your players, you'll know what they need. So the more time you spend with them, you know if they need an arm around the shoulder, if they need someone to support them from a emotional point of view, or just if they need support from a solutions point of view. And most of the time they just need to be heard. You just say, hey, how you doing? And then they'll vent a little bit, and that hopefully makes them feel better. But it's different for every person, I guess, is the takeaway.
Yeah, for sure. And just to touch on that kind of emotional understanding, I guess when we deny emotions, it denies the feedback that people use to solve emotions, right? So I think it's crucial that we kind of, straight after a loss, we have that kind of, there's that kind of breathing room. There's that breathing room for defeat. There's that breathing room for understanding, for resentment, for knowing that, I could have hit that skill shot. Are you kidding me? Why didn't I do that? I've done that in previous scrims. I did that yesterday in a game that wasn't even as important as this. I did it in a more important game. And I think when we have that understanding that when a player's done something previously, so they should be able to do it now, it's really straight and strict. But I definitely think you have to be flexible, and the players have to kind of understand that it's not always going to go the way it's going to go. And I think ultimately, emotions might not, emotions never last. What makes us happy or sad today doesn't last until tomorrow or the next day or the next week. I think it's crucial finding that period, that initial period, that middle period, and then that period at the end where we can start to promote change and look to the positives.
Yeah, I agree with that. I've just realized that when we were talking about how people deal with losses, I'm drawing on experience. I went back to when my team experienced a big loss, and I can see the faces of the players and how they reacted, and it really sapped the energy out of me. So I'm going to try move forward and out of that position again. Yeah, to what you mentioned about the dealing with loss in the short, medium, and long term, and then also making sure that they're given space. It's like really, really important that these really powerful kind of like experiences, like positive and negative, these are the ones where you actually are able to make the most change or get the most visceral changes, because you remember these situations more because the emotion involved is much higher. So players are going to mention like, oh, that time that I messed up my stopwatch or I missed my skill shot, that's what lost us the game, it's what lost us the series, we didn't go to Worlds. And that's really, really important. And you use those as platforms for the players to learn. This experiential value is huge. So the players are going to be able to look back in this situation, and that's going to be their motivation, their drive for not making that mistake again. So it might be like, yeah, I was really tired and I had no gas left for game 5. This could be your Japanese StarCraft player if he was in a team-based game, and he's like, no, I'm never going to put myself in that situation again. I'm going to make sure that before game day. I'm going to have a really good sleep schedule. I'm going to use my sleep hygiene protocols, and I'm going to make sure that experience, that negative experience that I had to suffer through, that's not going to be me again. And it's all of these life-changing experiences that usually lead to the most long-term change. It's like these guys who maybe didn't care about going to the gym or stretching or prehabilitation, and then they have an injury. They spend a year out on the sidelines where they learn about rehabilitation. They learn about how to look after themselves, and then they come back and they're like, okay, this isn't going to happen to me again. And then they spend so much time making sure that they take care of their bodies, and they make sure that they're getting their proper recovery and rest, that they are, I guess, like bulletproof at that point. And those are like really, really high emotional experiences that we kind of use as athletes to make sure that we learn from them. And as coaches, we have to play off of those experiences like a lot. But like you said, a time and a place, you don't want to be like, okay, here's the lesson you learned. This could be 5 minutes after the loss. It's like, no. Now it's not a teaching moment, but you can use that later on for sure.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely think that there's so many lessons that can be learned, and it's how we adopt these lessons and whether we implement them and how we implement them. That's crucial for change as well. Yeah. Now, one thing I wanted to also engage with you with and kind of get your kind of mindset and opinion is going into a big game, going into a best of 5, going into a decider, trying to prep the players. Did you have experiences where players were, they know what to do. They have their little pre-game routine. They make sure they're wearing their favorite shirt. They had their favorite meal before a game. They're just chilling by themselves, listening to their music. Their kind of pre-game routine was their players who completely were kind of shook. They didn't really understand the dynamics of playing on a big stage in front of thousands and thousands of people. Obviously, at that pro level, I assume they would have, but just for kind of comprehension, understanding. But what's that kind of mindset into helping players kind of get into that kind of pre-game visualization, pre-game warm-up mindset?
A good question. There's an interesting YouTube clip of, I think it's the Irish rugby team, and you've got Paul O'Connell, who was the captain at the time, and he's trying to get a rise out of all the players. He's shouting at them. He's full of energy, like he's building up that kind of like the pre-match kind of like, we're going to battle here. And then you have some guys that are, they're kind of like head down a little bit. They're focusing. They're not listening to music or anything. This is like the team time, right? This isn't the pre-match time. And they have their own little ritual. They don't need, let's say, more arousal. They actually need to maybe lower it down a little bit, or to make sure that they're like in an optimal level. So I find this really interesting because it shows that even though they're going into the same kind of situation, their mindsets are different. What they need is different. And at that level, international level, you fully realize or should understand what you need to get yourself in the right frame of mind. There's not someone coming around and you're not going into a game thinking, I'm not really interested in this game, or I had bad sleep, I'm not really fully focused. There's nothing like this. You've trained yourself, you've conditioned yourself, you've been like practicing the sport for so long that you know exactly what you need to play well. And that's something in esports that we haven't really figured out yet. This is like the lost art. It's where players are so flagrantly affected by external variables that affect how they play. And this is honestly self-confessed from them, that they struggle then, because it's like, I didn't play well, like I really slept badly, or I didn't play well, like I don't know, I was really hungry, I was really hot. Like there's a lot of different things. It kind of reminds me of like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And if they were able to control, I guess, like, or even be more aware about like the things that they need or how they're feeling and how to fix them themselves without being kind of susceptible to and affected by these things, without feeling like they have the power to control them, then they would definitely play better. So I just like that example of like, you kind of have to trust and hope that the players understand what they need. And then you kind of equip them with the tools to be able to fix it. So you have to kind of use some match days as practice for match days, if that makes sense. So your first couple of weeks is like, okay, we've been building up conditioning for match days, but it's not the same. This is an actual match day. I want to see how the players respond. I want to see how the players react. I want to see how they go about their routine, if they have a routine, if they don't have a routine, etc. And then see how they play. And then talk to them afterwards and then figure out, hey, what did you do? How did you feel? What was your energy like? How was your focus like? Did it feel normal? Did it feel like a normal match day? Did it feel different than practice? A lot of different questions to try to figure out, like, how cognizant were they of what was going on around them? Were they going through the motions? Were they letting the match day come to them? Or were they actually like running towards the match day? And that's important because some players will kind of just be sitting there. It's like being tied down to railroad tracks with train coming. That's different than actually just
thank you very much, as per usual, for tuning into another episode of Mind Clickers.
That's something that like,
with
some
your
players
host,
are very, very
Lachlan.
good at. Like,
really awesome episode with Hector today. Just digging deep and ripping apart some of those physical education aspects and how they can be incorporated into esports to ultimately help longevity for some of these esports players' careers. And as per usual, don't forget to check out our sponsor, Player 2 Second Hand Gaming. They've got a lot of new stocking nowadays, some modern games, some old games, and everything for every gamer. And remember to use code MIND10 for 10% off your entire order. They've got something for every gamer.
And I hadn't seen this type of behavior. I was like, are you okay? Because your mood seems a bit off. Like, you seem a bit like lost in thought, I guess. And he's like, no, I'm fine. And he was just wholly focused on the game. And this is during a best of 3 or 5. I can't remember which, but you know, his attitude was like very professional and his focus was laser like. And I think that he maybe has a bad reputation as someone who maybe doesn't take things seriously, but in actual fact it can be the opposite. Like, when it's actually game time, he switches on, and at least that's my experience with him. And I think that's very unique in that you can see how he approaches things, and you can see that nothing affects him. And that's like one of his biggest strengths, is that he's unflappable. Is that a term in Australia? Unflappable?
It is not, but now it is.
Nice.
Yeah, there's so many things that can be drawn out for pre-game kind of mindsets. And one thing that I'm really interested in from previous experiences is that mentality of preparing for things that can go wrong. Preparing for factors that can have a negative impact, right? So, you know, you have your external factors. In traditional sports, you know, you have bad umpiring decisions. You have things that, you know, you can't control. You have suddenly the other teams running faster. Suddenly you have teams that are lifting their intensity, right? Yeah. And then you have those internal factors, which can often arise from those external factors. You know, as soon as you see those guys lifting their intensity, you start to have negative thoughts about them and, you know, what they are capable of. And, you know, maybe I can't do that. You know, I'm not capable of that. I'm losing energy. I can't perform like they are. And I guess, do we see the same thing in esports? Do we see players, you know, having that external mindset of, I mean, you know, how can we see that? We can't really, you know, players can't adjust for umpiring, obviously. What sort of other things can, you know, prepare to go wrong?
Yeah. There are definitely things that esports athletes have to go through that are out of their control. We don't always have bad umpiring decisions or changes in weather, but things like playing with some packet loss, or playing with some lag, or maybe having a decision, you know, you pause the game, you think something happened in the game that shouldn't have happened, and then the referee says, no, this is as intended. And then you have to move on and play with the fact that you feel like, okay, I feel like I'm at a disadvantage now. That's something that my players have experienced before. One time as well, like what we'd like to do in practice sometimes before was to, if enemy team pauses for whatever reason, you're not allowed to like alt tab out and like browse or anything. You have to stay there. You have to sit there. You have to wait. And you can't talk because you're not going to do that on stage. And there'd be some pushback from a player who's like, "Oh, this is so boring. Why are we doing this? Like, Like, this is stupid. And then I remember it happened on a stage game where we had a pretty delayed pause, and then one of the players went, "Ah, okay, I see why Robert was making us like sit there and like wait and then not do something, because it can happen on stage." And sometimes they have to experience that thing happening in order for them to kind of understand and appreciate like why we're doing it. And it's never to like make them feel uncomfortable or to like uh what's the word? I wouldn't say bully, but to force them to do something they don't want to do. All of it
I
is
like
like
it.
with an intended purpose to just make sure that, listen, this can happen, and I want to make sure that you're prepared for it happening. And it's these small things that kind of add up, so that on game day you're making sure that if anything comes up, like any surprises, like how to react, because it's not new. There's an interesting book called The Power of Negative Thinking, and it kind of goes against the popular conjecture that you see in America and for performance coaches, that like you should always be positive, always look for the silver lining. But the book is interesting because it makes you think about anything bad that can happen, how it might happen, when it might happen, etc. And once you kind of are able to understand these and visualize them, you can put across like coping strategies or mechanisms to make sure that it doesn't happen. So it's not actually like the power of negative thinking, only thinking about negative. It's being able to look at negative things and then figure out how you can find the best path to avoid them. And I've kind of like incorporated that as much as possible into how I look at things. I'll definitely give myself a chance in the day or in the week to think about all the possible things that might happen, and then
Mm-hmm.
make sure I've got like reactions to them actually happening, so that I'm not going to be surprised. And then the player's kind of like, oh, wait, you actually have a plan for this happening. So yeah. Like in my mind, I'm always thinking about like worst case scenarios. And then that's like what coaches are doing as well, right? They have their draft and they're like, hey, this is worst case scenario. This is like really, really, really awful, but this probably won't happen. But if it does, at least you guys know what's actually like in front of you.
Yep. And where do we draw the line with overthinking in a negative aspect? Do we draw the line at, hey, as you just said, hey, this is what could happen. If this happens, let's do X or let's do Y or let's do Z. We have something in plan to help counteract that. Personally speaking, previously in traditional sport, when I used to do Taekwondo, when I chatted with my coach, he was so really focused, hyper focused on the things that can go wrong. This can go wrong, that can go wrong, this can go wrong, that can go wrong. And that kind of, hearing that, I started to believe that it will go wrong. And
Mm,
I started to, misinform my mindset on not the strengths of my abilities, but, it's going to happen. This is inevitable that I'm going to, do an axe kick and break my leg. It's
yeah.
one of those things that, is out of my control, but it's inevitable. So where do we draw the line with, chatting with players and chatting with coaches to ensure that we don't overstress, don't overpressure the players?
Yeah, it's interesting premise, because you want to make sure they're prepared for every eventuality, but you also want to make sure that when they're going into the game, that they are primarily thinking of positive outcomes, like things that can go well, things that will go right, things that are in their
Mm-hmm.
control. And I think it's like topping up a cup with two different liquids. You want to make sure that there is a certain element of that they're allowed to express the negative outcomes that may possibly happen, and they understand that, yeah, this might happen, but we are prepared for it. We know what will happen, and our reaction will be this. But then also you're filling up the rest of the cup with like, this is our game plan, this is what we're doing, this is what you're in control over, this is what we've practiced, this is why we're doing it, and this is why you will be successful. So before the game starts, there's a lot of like talking with the players to make sure that they understand their role, they understand that this is what they have to do, no more, no less, especially in a team-based game, so that they're not going to be overreaching. They're not going to be social loafing and doing less because someone else has a bigger role to play. Everyone has a role to play. And in the team-based game, it's very easy to be like, well, I don't have the ball, you have the ball, so the game-winning shot's on you. Like, if we win, it's great. It's you. If we lose, it's your fault too. It's a team game, so everyone can make their teammates' job a little bit easier by making sure they do their job a little bit better. So I would never say they have to do more. They just have to do their job a little bit better.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, we look to some kind of basis originally in regards to leadership. Have you seen previously working with teams where there's one player that's just straight up has those leadership qualities? They naturally take the lead. They naturally help help their teammates with buy-in, for example. They help to promote those positive mindsets.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of different types of leaders that I've seen from different teams. Some of them were the leader, but they were maybe slightly dysfunctional or disrupted. Some of them were the leader, but were inconsistent. Some of them were the leaders, but they were not vocal. There's an interesting book that I read called Captain's Class, and it kind of looks to extrapolate what separates like really, really good teams from freak teams that have had accomplishments that were never bested or equaled. And I think there was 13? I think with 13 teams at the end that had accomplishments that were never bested, that were never equaled. And they put them into tiers. So tier 1 was these, I think, 13 teams. And tier 2 was like the Manchester United treble winning team, for example. Tier 3 was like, these are all like fantastic teams, and you're thinking like they're all like the best of the best. Like, what actually separates them? And from the book, they kind of looked at, it wasn't financial clout, it wasn't how much money they had, it wasn't the GMs, it wasn't the coach. It was actually, these teams had outstanding periods of success that started with a specific player coming into the team and ended almost as abruptly when that player left the team. This was the captain. And when he came into the team, he wasn't necessarily the captain, he was just a guy. But the qualities that these captains had was not your typical giving a big speech, it's a game of inches kind of a captain. It was a very work-related, very servant leader type of captain. The sort of guy that like takes your bags from the bus to the hotel room. The sort of guy that will like look after you. And I think this is the sort of guy that does his job, doesn't complain, holds people accountable, and that's it. It's a very boring kind of a life, but they give everything that they have, and the players around them can see that, and they can like build off of that. They can resonate with that consistency with this person who will not change their habits or their thoughts based on anything external. This is who they are, like it or lump it. And in esports, these kind of people they're not really lauded that much in terms of how popular they are or how impactful they would necessarily be, because of the fact they're doing their job and doing it well, and they're not looking for any fanfare afterwards. You could probably make a list of players that maybe tick all of these boxes from any esport, and their value is a little bit less because of the fact that they don't necessarily have to make the flashy plays, but they make everyone else around them better. And you'll see teams that will lose this type of player, and then they will maybe drop off or struggle a little bit more. And you're thinking, why? The person we replaced them with is a clear upgrade mechanically or like whatever, but that team misses out on some things like the heartbeat of the team or the battery of the team. And that's something I'm looking at when I look at players, is to see these intangible qualities and try to figure out what role they fill, what players that you can use to build around them would complement each other the best. And I think that's like a really interesting part of like esports teams, is try to figure out like what teams might be successful over others based off of like intangible traits, as opposed to or not necessarily how they play in the game.
Yeah, completely agree, especially with those, I guess, intangible traits of a leader. And I guess, as you said, someone who doesn't complain, holds people accountable, and, that kind of really exciting or facilitated job that, goes leaps and bounds, but someone who has that ability and mindset to keep everything, maybe in order, won't change their habits. And I think what it comes down to is that when you have someone like that on the team, it can definitely influence some of the players. And one of the biggest things, I've had a chat with a couple of previous players here on Mind Clickers. So I've previously had So I've had Shinobi on, so the ex in-game leader from the Cloud9 Valorant team, and Rice, so a player here from OS. And one of the big things that we chatted both of those players about was self-efficacy. So that individualized mindset that they can do something. And kind of that comparison between self-confidence and self-efficacy. So self-confidence being that generalized belief versus self-efficacy being that specialized belief. And they said that when they had, obviously Shinobi being that being an in-game leader, having those like leadership qualities, he really resonated with that fact that, in order to help promote change with a teammate or player, sometimes it's good to be more direct. Sometimes it's good to be indirect. And it's definitely individual specific. So I think it's one of those characteristics that's important to understand. They could be different for everyone. But then, understanding that some people's own belief in their own abilities can change, depending on their mindset, depending on the previous game, depending on fatigue, depending on cognitive fatigue. So I think it's important to keep those things accountable.
Yeah. A good leader will be able to be consistent in their approach, but also recognize that certain people need different things. Like everyone's an individual, and what works for one is not necessarily for the other person. But at the same time, that doesn't let them influence, let's say, their values, their priorities.
Definitely.
So the values and priorities are more important than the individual for the captain. Because usually we're like, okay, well, we have to treat this guy differently because he's a different player. He needs this and this, and we'll let our value structure kind of like bend a little bit or break in places, because we're in this kind of like a culture now where it's like you have to treat everyone, I guess, like in a special way, because we're very cognizant of the fact that that everyone is different and they require different things. But I think it's less like that. The value structure, the priorities you have are ever present and don't change, so that the player has to learn to kind of like develop and grow around them rather than the other way around. And that makes it a lot easier, because honestly, players need, especially in esports, they need something to use as their measuring stick, their yardstick, so that they know, like, this is always going to be the same. This is a great quote that I've shared with people before. Is like, this is the bar, it doesn't lower. So this is the standards that we have. This is the standards, we don't lower them.
Yep.
Players then know that they have to get over that bar. They have to reach these standards, and that the standards aren't going to change. Because if you keep on changing the bar or the standards for every different player, some players want it higher, some people are happy, some people need it lower. People are going to complain about it. But if they know that it doesn't change, then it's like, okay, no matter who you are or who comes in, this is the standard you have to reach. And they're like, okay, at least I have something stable in my life to aim for. This is my goal.
Yeah, right. And who is in control of that bar? Is it you, the performance coach? Is it the head coach? And what dictates where that bar sets, how high or how low it is? Is it in the same group, a different team, the other teams, the competitors, they're doing this way. So in order to beat them, we need to try and, at least get on their level in regards to, they have they're addressing sleep, they're addressing hydration. So we need to try and do these things to try and catch up. Is that the sort of mindset, or are we looking at more so we're going to have our own individualized approach? We're going to set our own bar within our own team. We're going to create our own goals so that these goals are a lot more catered specifically for our players.
Yeah, good question. I think it really depends on the coaching staff you have. This is our trip to Cancun. Remember when we go and we kind of have a team bonding session and we figure out like what we want to do as coaches and like what we're willing to hold the players accountable to. So we kind of come out of that trip there with the bar, the standard set, and we talk about how we're going to enforce it, how we're going to communicate it, how we're going to reprimand, but also like compliment players on sticking and meeting these standards. So it depends on like that body of experience that a coach has. So what has he seen being successful for him? What does he look at and go, this is what we need to do to be successful? If you have a coach that's first timing their job and they haven't had that experience, then they're like going, I think this is what works. like based off of like my knowledge, this is what I think works, and we're going to try it. Different coaches that have been successful for a while and have a large body of experiential work, they're like, okay, this is what I know works. This is what has worked for me in the past. This is what we're going to do in the future. They kind of have this like confidence, this aura about them, where when they're talking about something, there's no doubt in their voice. There's no room for like, I guess, like questioning. It's like, okay, I trust this guy. Like he's going to take us to the promised land. So it's that experience. It's that like determination from that person, and it's usually like a singular driving force that like tells everyone this is what we're doing. That's usually the person that sets the bar. On a team where you have like a veteran player, then maybe it's that player who like holds the players accountable. But it can be harder. It could be an in-game thing. It could be a game day thing. But I feel like it's a combination of one or two leaders from inside the team, and then like a singular kind of like more vocal coach together. And then now you've got like a trinity of like people that are inside and outside of the game that are pushing the same agenda. And I think that's like really, really important.
Yeah, I definitely agree. What if we have, say, for example, a performance coach and a head coach who have different mindsets towards something, who don't, agree? Is it, a matter of finding compromise? Is it a matter of finding even playing ground? Or is it a matter of more so the performance coach kind of submitting and saying, okay, I agree, let's do this instead? Or is it, a matter of let's try and work it out, let's experiment like you did earlier with the semicircle, trying to incorporate different kind of approaches?
Oh, it's actually just a fight to the death, and then the winner gets to choose the direction of the team. That's in my experience, and I'm still alive. No, it's really just like it's a compromise at best. If you're in a situation where it's one or the other, then that's a tough situation. But I would always say that the performance coach obviously has to bow to the needs of the head coach. So if the head coach is like, no, we can't do that, then it's like, okay, fair enough. Like we're not going to do it, because the head coach usually has the player's ear. Usually they, honestly speak League of Legends language better than the performance coach. I'd like it to be a situation where it's like, listen, this is your expertise. I'm going to follow along with what you think is correct. But honestly, a middle ground would be just better, because you can see that the other person is giving a little. And then in situations where the head coach is like, this is really important, we need to do this, and I'm like, I don't fully understand, but I trust you because you seem really confident about it, then I also give a little, right? And it shouldn't be one person sacrificing for the other person, because like time is a commodity. I'm aware of that, and time is limited, but it's all about trying to be more efficient, and it's like a give and take. There'll be certain points where I've been vocal about where I think like this is really important and I'd like to do it, and then the coach goes, yeah, okay, let's fit it in there, let's do this, and how can I help? And then there's times where I'm, I guess, like giving up what I feel like is a priority for something else. And it's trust. It's the same way when you're in game as a player and you're like, you trust me, like come now, and you're not sure why you're coming as a jungler, but your top laner is like telling you to come top, and then you get the kill, and you're like, okay, I trusted you, and like you've repaid my trust in you. So like that kind of a thing. And it's definitely a give and take. It's definitely like a relationship, or it should feel that way. And you should feel like you're getting something out of it and that you're appreciated on both sides.
Yeah, gotcha. So having that kind of understanding that, not everything's going to go the way we want it to go, but then kind of having that ability to kind of compromise and understand that maybe the other way's for the better, and then we can start to kind of understand the indifferences, but then also understand the differences as well. So I think it's crucial to have that mindset. Before we start to wrap up, man, I feel like we could talk for hours, don't you? We've touched on so many good things. Just before we finish up, I got a couple more things that I'm really curious and just passionate about hearing. Just a few more things. So in regards to when you were performance coach for Immortals and Misfits, in regards to cognitive testing, was there anything employed here? For example, choice reaction time tests for, for example, you want to make sure you hit the right button for flash, for example. Doing visual search acquisition tests for map awareness as well. Was there any sort of like tests, pre-season, then do one post-season? What was the mindset there?
it's difficult because trying to find a CRT for League of Legends or an
Mm,
esport is hard
specific.
because there's not a lot of crossover.
Yep.
I guess a good example of this is like when Pobelter went to ESPN Sports Science, they brought him in. If you've seen that show, it's where they bring on athletes and they test them in various ways. He was the first esports athlete to
Right.
go on it, and they tested him against a novice person who didn't really know League of Legends, and they did
Uh-huh.
a couple of like reaction time tests, etc. And there wasn't a huge difference between them, even though they're using the mouse. But the big difference came when he was in game, like what actually happened to him, like his heart rate lowering, his ability to multitask increasing, etc. Like it's very hard to find an applicable test that is or taxes the same kind of senses and skill sets as League of Legends or as CS:GO, because really it's a very niche kind of a specific skill set that these guys have. So they might be bad at other games. They might just be really, really good at League of Legends. They might not have the best reaction times. They're getting beat by their social media manager in terms of reaction times, but they just crushed everyone else. Like they're in that like upper percentile in League of Legends. So we didn't incorporate that as much as we did, let's say, trying to find metrics, whether it be through eye tracking or
Mm.
HRV or something, to try and figure out like how does their game day performance differ from practice day performance, or how does their, let's say, best practice day performance differ from the average, and then try to figure out why that is exactly. Like, are there external variables that can be linked towards like why they perform better or worse? Is it a mindset thing? Is it an arousal thing? And I think that has a lot more value, because you could theoretically do a study where it's like, okay, we have this guy on a strength conditioning program. We have this guy doing meditation, mindfulness, or whatever it might be, and how it affects and how they play. But a lot of that depends on like steady variables. When you're changing the champion you play versus the opponent you play versus the team comp you're playing on, it can make it really hard to find key performance variables. And I think a lot of esports teams have been looking at what are the key performance variables? What can I use as metrics for tracking the progress of players in relation to interventions? And it's hard because everything changes so much. Which is why I think it's kind of like baseball in a way, where a lot of it is an eyeball test. So like from the movie Moneyball, he had all these old guys in the room and they're talking about
Hey.
like
Yep.
um really like backwards things, like, oh well, look at his partner, and she wasn't attractive, so like what is that saying about his confidence, and like really weird stuff like that. But in esports, a lot of it is eyeball tests and looking at like how they play, how they speak, how they interact, etc. And if we did have key performance indicators for esports, it would probably be like a little bit of a game changer, because it would be really easy just to parse through data from solo queue and in-houses and go, okay, well, these are the highest performing players, or they have the highest capacity for development, and we'll just take all of them, and then hopefully they develop. But then the intangible again comes down to like coaching style, coaching staff, player development, right? Because just because they have the potential doesn't mean that they're all going to hit their ceiling.
Yeah, for sure. Man, I love this topic. I had a couple of chat with a couple of other performance coaches. Um, just the whole mindset in regards to implementation of sports science for esports, whether we can, as you said, look at eye tracking, look at, visual search acquisition through eye tracking and how that can be implemented, and whether that will be the norm going into esports in the next couple of years. And what that'll look like, I had a chat with a sports psych a while ago on the topic of breathing. So, in an FPS, for example, do players hold their breath in a clutch situation?
Mm-hmm.
Could be the same in league in a team fight. A crucial team fight that's win or lose. Could be going for a Baron steal. It could be anything. Do players start to hold their breath because they're so hyper dynamically focused in on what they have to do in the next 10, 20, 30 seconds that they just forget about breathing? And then, of course, we can also look at heart rate, different heart rate spikes in, pre-lobby in regards to mid-game, late game, early game, first engagements, first blood, all the type of different metrics. There's so much things you could look at and that impact in regards to physiological data. And it's really interesting to see where we're going to see this in the next few years. Is this going to be the normal? Is this going to be something that's going to be pivotal for esports? Because we track all this data in traditional sports. So why can't we start hooking up esports players to a heart rate monitor and then go ham?
Yeah, we did that a long time ago. So
Oh wow.
we we thought it was interesting, so we did it from a qualitative approach, and like it wasn't a study, it was just I was curious. And the players that we thought would have like a really high kind of like HR during the game, actually it was kind of the opposite. It was like actually pretty low, but we found that certain players, like playmaking players, their heart rates would spike before or anticipation of a big play. So whether that would be like a team engagement where it's all on them, or it's a TP. So we had a player whose heart rate was like actually decently low, considering he was a really extroverted, like loud kind of guy, but he was a pretty normalized heart rate, pretty consistent until, let's say, he's the guy that's making the big TP play, and then his heart rate would spike really really high, and it would
Wow.
spike a little bit if like it's like he's like, oh, I'm looking, and then nothing happened. Okay, no, I can't TP, I can't. And then if he actually made the TP, like it's like channeling whatever, and then as it's channeling, like his heart rate spiking up and up because people know what's about to happen. It's about to go down. You know, we're about to have a big team fight, and you're kind of like you've shown your hand at that point. So I found that like it's really interesting, and it made me think about like traditional sports as well. Like recovery isn't, or fitness isn't like your high heart rate. It's how quickly you can go from a high heart rate to a low heart rate. So
Wow.
the psychophysiological responses to stress, let's say if you have a high heart rate, let's say if you're drinking caffeine or something, or stress, you kind of equate that to anxiety. So if you have a high heart rate throughout the entire game, maybe you are equating that to being more stressed. So if you have a lower resting heart rate, if you have a lower average heart rate during the game, maybe you're going to equate that to less stress. So it's kind of like helping the players understand what the physiological changes are during a game in response to competition actually mean,
Hmm.
versus, let's say, your psychological well-being, which or state during the game is, which is always going to be a bit different. So, it's like teaching that young player that, hey, having nerves, having that like butterflies in your stomach before a game is actually fine. It's normal. Everyone
Yeah.
has them, even guys who are really experienced. But the guys who are experienced learn to frame that as preparation for competition. And if you don't have that, it's actually worse, because it means that you're not actually attached, or you have no arousal towards the competition at all. You're just there, but you actually need those kind of things. It's like anticipatory to let you know that something's about to happen.
Dang. Yeah, I love it. I absolutely love it. I love that kind of direct and indirect kind of characteristics that we can draw from the psychological data and then the physiological data and what that looks like. And it's such a powerful tool that we can use. And if we start to look at it, I'm sure that a lot of tier one teams, people with those resources, are doing this right now. And it just becomes a matter of when is the underdogs, when is the tier two, the tier three, the tier four teams going to start to adopt this? And obviously resources is one of those another topics for another time. You can go right in depth in regards to resources for teams and their availabilities, but it's one of those things that's going to be definitely interesting to look forward to in the next couple of years and how it's going to progress. Yeah, fantastic. And just before we start to wrap up now, one last thing I wanted to engage with you was your time as head coach back at FlyQuest. One of the big things, obviously, in regards to league experience, how much knowledge what was required to kind of fulfill this role? Was it more so you understand the different strats, understanding all the champions? What was kind of required in terms of game knowledge?
For that role itself, I think like it already had 1 year, 2 years actually in esports with Immortals. So you kind of need to understand like the practice demands, right? It's like a needs
Mm,
analysis of like what the players will require on a daily basis, like and planning that out. So for the most part, you're always going to be working with a strategy coach. You're going to be working with someone that their main priority is to get the players to play well in the game, and you
yep.
just have to like figure out how to I guess, like set them up for success, and how to balance the needs of the players and the coach with like what they actually maybe should be doing. And I think that's maybe where the performance coach aspect comes in, where you're in a position to maybe push the agenda of things that wouldn't normally get like pushed from a player development or player wellness point of view. And I think you're there to like marry those two worlds as much as possible. And like the longer I've been in esports, the more I've kind of realized it doesn't matter as much, because whether or not you come in as a performance coach or a head coach,
Right.
as long as you have some sort of buy-in from all members of staff or like the org, that they kind of understand that it's facilitative, it's collaborative, then that's the most important thing. Because sometimes like in the off season, I've been asked like, well, do you want to be head coach or do you want to be performance coach? And I just say it doesn't matter. And what matters is that the person that I'm working with kind of understands my remit. And I definitely have a list of people where I'm like, yeah, I would care what I was called or what my title would be if I'm working with this guy, because I know that he values what I do, and he, more importantly, understands like how it works. So
Right.
I think the most important thing is figuring out like how the pieces are going to work together. Like, don't just hire people because you're ticking boxes. Like, hire them because you can see how they're going to work together, and you're setting them up for success. You're not like putting two polar opposites together and being like, okay, you got to work it out because you're the best at what you do. You're the best at what you do. And
Mm-hmm.
you got to find a way. It's like, well, it might be really difficult because we don't see things eye to eye from the get-go, nor have we had our coach boot camp like together somewhere to like figure them out. You're kind of figuring them out as you're trying to coach the players. And that's very hard, because players can see when coaching staff are not on the same page. Players can see when they haven't clearly figured out like how they're going to work together yet. And I think that's kind of doing the players a disservice if you're hoping that they can figure it out, staff, and maybe they started off too far apart to come together in time. So it's important in the same way you kind of construct a team. It's important that you construct a staff kind of the same way. And the more experience and specialty that a certain member of staff has, the more of a strong opinion they're going to have on what they feel like is correct. So if you bring in people that are very, very confident in what they feel like is the correct way to go about things, then they're going to require more time to kind of blend and get to know each other and to learn how to work together.
Yeah, to learn how to kind of understand on each levels, understand what wavelengths, and some person might be on channel 95 while the other person's on channel 13, but then you have to try and meet each other each way at channel 50. Love it.
Yeah.
Absolutely love it. Just before we wrap up, I'm going to put you on the spot here, Robert. For all those listening, so we've got some professional players listening, we've got some researchers, we've got some coaches, some organization owners listening in. If you had just a couple of words to share, or some insights to provide to some of these guys to start to think about performance, the performance mindset, and the importance of starting to understand all of these external factors and not just focus purely on the in-game mindset, what would you say?
I would say it's a similar premise to when you're looking at the relationship of aging in esports and performance.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a commonly held idea that you reach a certain age, your mechanics drop off, and you can't play as well. Ergo, you must retire early, and it's a young man's game. The average age of players across almost every esport is increasing. So players are staying longer, they're having longer careers. That's a similar idea to, let's say, what we have now with regard player development in esports. It's kind of seen as any time that we spend towards player development is time spent away from the game, which is bad, that we need to keep playing more of the video game in order to get better. And if we actually look at it, we'll find that there is a cutoff point where you're going to get diminishing returns. You're going to get a cutoff point whereby more time spent playing the game is actually not going to give you the improvements that you want. So that time is better spent doing other things. That time is better spent increasing value in areas maybe outside of the game. Because save for a couple of very, very high level teams that are either experts in their role or they are just individually talented and have a lot of experience. The majority of teams kind of struggle to build that cohesion and build that kind of like team camaraderie and spirit and longevity. And for every 12-month period or split that a team has being successful, there's often a lot of time where teams are struggling to try and find that kind of winning formula. So I would say we need to kind of look at how everything ties together and not just like tick this box. We have a performance coach, we have a coach, we have this, we have that. And I wonder why it didn't work. There needs to be a little bit more deliberate planning that goes involved, a little bit more collaboration between all partners in all bodies to try and figure out how we get this moving. Because for the most part, unless you have, I guess, like someone like Young Buck, right, who has won LEC so many times and has this really like strong opinion about how the game should be played and what he needs, it's hard because it's a player, it's a coaching staff, it's a player development kind of carousel of changes. And I think like a lot of the teams that are most successful tend to be a little bit more deliberate in how they approach things. So that would be the long-winded version of like, I think we should just be a little bit more considered about like what we're doing and be a bit more open towards external opinions and external avenues about how and what success looks like.
Fantastic. I'm sure that everyone listening, everyone tuning into the episode, everyone having a listen can take away so many key points from that and so many key ideas, acknowledgements, understandings and appreciations that can go into tomorrow's game, that can be extrapolated into tomorrow's performance, next month's game, or even next year's new organization that's being founded. It was an absolutely pleasure to have you on, Robert. I'm sure that everyone listening has probably gone big brain mode right now. It's been a really good chat, and I really appreciate it. We really touched on quite a few different topics, some topics that were really quite deep and really understanding from a behavioral kind of emotional kind of change recognition level, your previous experience in a performance coaching role and head coach, understanding the different domains of self-efficacy, self-confidence, and of course team dynamics and team culture. And then addressing on different leadership qualities and styles as well. So I really appreciate you jumping on. For everyone listening, where can we find you on your socials to get in contact with you or have a chat with you or question you about something further?
My socials, so for Twitter and for Instagram, it's at Coach Yip. That's YIP. My DMs are open if anyone wants to like send me a message. I usually try to make it a priority to get back to people as much as I can. So if you have a question about something, I'll respond as quickly as I can. And once again, like really, really enjoyable being on the podcast with you, man. It was like great talking to you, and time flew by so fast.
Mate, who knows? Maybe we'll have part 2 scheduled sometime in the future when we've got some more experience. Well, not you. You're a veteran. Myself personally, I can come on and I can share some more kind of insights, and we can chat about different dynamics and all that sensing as well.
Awesome. Looking forward to it. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
You too, man.
Thank you.